Hey everybody, it's my birthday, and obviously this is the special birthday review for this year. And these past few weeks haven't exactly been the best weeks for me, so I've been a bit down lately. And so I was trying to go through my games collection and find something that would definitely fit the bill for my birthday review this year. And I think I might have found my answer. Take a look. I get the feeling that the folks who are asking me, hey, when are you going to review Nintendo games, are screaming right about now, but here you go. My review of Super Smash Bros. Melee for GameCube. This is a fighting game by HAL Laboratory and published by Nintendo exclusively for GameCube in 2001, although it did see release in 2002 in some territories, and it went on to get absolutely massive amounts of critical acclaim. It is the best-selling game for the entire GameCube platform, and it is the most well-beloved of the entire Super Smash Bros. Series. And it even went on to become extremely popular in the competitive scene. In fact, it's the most popular of the Super Smash Bros. Games for competitive play, and that probably comes as a pretty big surprise given that not only is this a game from 2001 and there's been two major entries in the Super Smash Bros. Series since then, but also it's a Nintendo game that's a fighting game, and that it's not exactly something you would really consider to be a competitive game to begin with. So let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out what exactly makes it big in the competitive scene, as well as whether or not that love for it is just nostalgia, or whether or not it's actually a good game underneath all that hype. Oh, who am I kidding? This game's friggin' fantastic! And it even starts out that way from the presentation. Now, you have to keep in mind, this game came out in 2001. It's very, very dated in terms of visual quality, but that really doesn't matter all that much. They absolutely nailed the art direction with this thing. You've got modeling that is surprisingly detailed, texture work that is certainly not all that detailed, but is extremely fitting for the art style they've gone for, which is that very cartoony Nintendo art style. It is bright, it is colorful, it is very stylized, and even though you don't have a lot to impress you from a visual quality standpoint, you got plenty to impress you in sheer charm value. And all that still holds up to this day, which is incredibly impressive considering this thing renders at sub 480p. Well, at least it does on my system. If you had a component cable, you could actually run this thing in 480p, but those are really hard to come by and are very, very expensive. But that's the thing, regardless of what it renders at, they just put in so much attention to detail for what they were going for, which is just making it absolutely nail that Nintendo feel, that ultimately it really doesn't matter so much what it's rendered at. It also helps that the sound design is fantastic for this thing, from the soundtrack, which is ripped mostly from various Nintendo games, but there are a few tracks that are unique to Super Smash Bros. Melee as well. And outside of the Smash Bros. Exclusive tracks, you get tracks that are all very recognizable and very easy to get into. They also did a pretty good job with the voice acting, what little there is of it anyway, and the sound effects, where they're surprisingly hard-hitting for being so incredibly cartoony. They definitely fit the vibe, and you really do get the feeling that they put a lot of attention to detail in the sound effects and the music, and making it all feel very Nintendo, for lack of a better term. Voice acting is definitely what you would expect from Nintendo at this point. There's really not that much to it other than a couple of voices here and there for certain characters, and some of it's entirely in Japanese, like, for example, Roy and Marth. So don't really go into it expecting much in the way of voice acting, because you're mostly just going to hear a bunch of yelling and screaming and grunts of pain and things like that, and not really much else. But of course what really matters here is the gameplay, because as far as story goes, there really isn't any. It's pretty much just the idea of, hey, we've got all these different characters, let's just throw them all in a fighting game and just have fun. And about the closest they really get to a storyline with that is the opening cutscene, which I showed you most of in the early part of this video, where it's basically the idea of taking a bunch of toys and throwing them into an arena and just having them duke it out for no discernible reason. And that's exactly what happens here. This of course means that it does fall entirely to the gameplay to bring things up, and luckily that's where this game really shines. Mechanically, it's a very simple game that is very easy to pick up and play. You have a basic attack button and a secondary attack button, and you move around using the analog stick. There's also the up button on the D-pad that will allow you to do a taunt, and you have a button for blocking as well as a button for a grapple move. And instead of a health bar or anything along those lines, you have a percentage, and the higher the percentage, the more likely it is that you're going to be knocked out of the arena. And that's basically how you win. You just knock all the other players out of the arena, and either you're going for a score where you get the highest number of eliminations, or you're going for elimination where you have limited lives. And if you're the last one standing, then you win that particular match. And each of the 25 characters has a different set of moves available to them depending on how you move the analog stick and how you use your different attack buttons. For example, Link has a secondary attack, which is just his bow if he stands still, but if he goes one direction or another and presses the B button, then it's actually going to be a boomerang throw instead. Every character also has the up B move, which is a move that will propel them to a higher position, which is really useful if you get knocked off an edge and you're trying to get back up onto the arena. But other than that, it also does a very large amount of damage compared to other attacks. The thing is, if you don't land after you do that immediately, then you're actually exposed through the entirety of your descent. There's also the so-called smash attacks, which are when you quickly move the analog stick and press the primary attack button, which is the A button, in order to do a more powerful attack that can be charged up. You can also use the C stick, which is the yellow stick if you're not familiar with the GameCube controller, in order to quickly execute a smash attack, although it won't be a fully charged one. The block button can be used to either absorb attacks until your shield breaks, or to quickly dodge in a direction if you quickly move the analog stick and press the button at the same time. No doubt you've noticed by now, but I am absolutely horrible at dodging in this game, so don't even bother trying to call me out on it. I know. Then of course there's the grapple move, where you can hold the enemy and punch them for additional damage until they break away from it anyway, or you can throw the enemy off into a specific direction, which can be very useful if you're on edge, for example, and the enemy has taken a lot of damage already. And so you're basically competing against the other players to raise their damage meter up high enough to where you can actually knock them off of the arena without much difficulty. And it's a thing where the simplicity of the mechanics really does shine, because despite the mechanics themselves being relatively simple, the fact that they did manage to make 25 different characters in this thing and have relatively few of them feel pretty much the same really does speak volumes for how they can take a simple mechanic and expand it out to be much more than simply being a simple mechanic. That said, there is a reason that you see certain characters popping up constantly and other characters not really popping up at all. That's because some of them are rather overpowered compared to others. There's all the fighters that were in the original Super Smash Bros. That return to this one, and they're all basically powerhouses. And then you have some of the other ones, like the Ice Climbers, for example. I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually play Ice Climbers seriously. That's not to say that you can't win as the Ice Climbers, it's just to say that it's very, very difficult because they're really not very good. Generally, my preferred characters are Link and Roy, and that's probably showing because when I play as basically anybody else, I'm pretty awful. Of course, that's kind of irrelevant because I'm not even remotely close to tournament level on any of these characters, even the ones that I play the absolute most. That's not to say that I'm absolutely atrocious. I am able to play this thing on the highest difficulty setting, which is difficulty level 9, and I'm able to hold my own in that. But we're not talking a master of Smash here. And I've never really intended to be that. This isn't the kind of game that you look at and go, yeah, this is something that I really want to play in the competitive scene. It's a whimsical, wacky, fighting game that doesn't really take itself seriously at all. You have a campaign that gives you a bunch of different fights against different characters in different scenarios, ultimately culminating in the Master Hand battle, where you fight a gigantic gloved hand, and it's pretty ridiculous. So you look at this kind of thing and you go, yeah, this isn't the kind of game I'm going to take remotely seriously, and yet it spawned a pretty massive competitive community, and that's for a couple of reasons. First off, it's a very easy game to get into. There's not really much to it in terms of its mechanics, which means that it's very easy to pick up and play. At the same time, there's a fair few tricks to the way the movement works, because the controls are very, very sensitive, which means that you do need to know what you're doing in order to get the absolute most out of them. High-level Smash play is pretty much nothing like low-level Smash play, or even mid-level Smash play, and so it ends up being a lot like pretty much any other competitive fighting game out there, where there is a massive difference in the skill between people who actually play in the tournaments and the people who just play them for fun. The difference is that Melee never really was meant to be a competitive game to begin with. It was pretty much considered as a party game, and for that purpose, it is utterly fantastic. There are a lot of settings you can mess around with in this thing, from the amount of lives that you get in the survival mode, to the amount of time you get in the score attack mode, to different bizarre modes like sudden death that will just be complete chaos, all the way to a sort of challenge mode that is 50 different levels of specific challenges that will allow you to test your mettle. And there's even a bracketed tournament mode where you can set up a tournament with as many characters as you want, up to 32 players, and you can just kind of switch off between different people until you finally get to the last battle, and whoever wins is the person who won that tournament. Yes, there is actually a built-in tournament mode in this thing, and you can set it up yourself. Now, I don't think it was put in there as anything more than, hey, this would be kind of a cool feature, wouldn't it? But at the same time, look at where we are today, where Smash Brothers is pretty much a staple of fighting game tournaments at this point. But don't let that fool you, because this thing's really in its element when you just get a bunch of friends together and you just start screwing around on the various wacky levels that have you just constantly hopping around for your life when the scenery changes up and suddenly you're having to worry about not falling to your doom. With so many options to mess around with, there is plenty of longevity in this thing, and again, to this day, it is still being played in the competitive scene, let alone in people's living rooms. Hell, to this day, whenever I'm feeling like I just want some quick casual fighting game fun, I will put in Super Smash Bros. Melee over just about any other fighting game out there. It's not necessarily because it's better than them in all respects, it's just that it's just a ridiculously fun game to play. In terms of mechanics, it has a rather high skill ceiling, but is extremely easy to pick up and play. From a content perspective, there is a lot on offer here, from the sheer amount of characters to the sheer amount of stages. It's just got a lot of stuff in it that will keep you busy for quite some time. And from a more general perspective, it is incredibly obvious that the developers just wanted you to have fun playing this thing. And it really does show whenever you just boot up the game and you have the controller in your hand. It's almost impossible to not have fun playing this thing, and that's something that is definitely an achievement. As not to say it doesn't have its problems. As I mentioned before, the controls are very responsive. In fact, they're a bit too responsive, which means that unless you're one of those more high-level skill players, you're gonna find that the controls can be a bit messy sometimes. It's a bit too easy to just start sprinting all over the place instead of doing what you really want it to do. But that's really a matter more of learning the timings and learning how to not overcompensate, so to speak. So the mileage varies considerably on that. There's also the issue of certain characters being pretty underpowered and other characters being fairly overpowered, but you can kind of work around that. If you know what you're doing, it's fairly easy to compensate for your own character's misgivings, as well as compensate for other characters' strengths. And that's part of the fun of playing a fighting game, is figuring out how to outwit your opponents and outplay them. And then of course there's the problem of they never re-released this thing on Virtual Console, for example, so basically the only way to get it is if you have an actual GameCube copy, which is pretty annoying if you didn't start playing GameCube back in the day. Now, I did play back in the day, so I do have this back from then, but at the same time, it definitely limits the audience that this thing can actually meet, because, let's face it, not everybody has a GameCube, or original Wii for that matter, and not everybody can actually find a copy of this game for a reasonable price. And I guess if you compare it to the original Super Smash Bros., it wasn't really all that ambitious. It did do a bunch of different things, it did introduce a fair amount of content, but ultimately it's pretty much the same game, just slightly better. And that's really all it needed to be, because Melee still is, to this day, the best game in the entire Smash Bros. Series. And if you own a GameCube or an original Wii, you probably should own a copy of Super Smash Bros. Melee. Trust me on that. I give it a 4.5 out of 5. Yes, it's not a perfect game. It's not going to appeal to everybody. But for most people, this is an absolute joy to play. It is a fantastic game, and I very, very highly recommend it if you can get your hands on a copy. Thanks for watching.